Hello, and welcome to the Population Factor. I'm your host, Phil Cafaro. Today on the Population Factor, we discuss solutions. Although many environmental trends are grim, there are clear paths forward toward a more sustainable world, if we're willing to address human numbers. When I bring up population and the environment, one of the most frequent responses I hear is, I get it. More people mean more pollution. More people means less habitat for other species. But what can we do about it? People often don't know. Well, that's our topic for today, solutions. Here to help us sort things out are Bill Ryerson, president of the Population Media Center, and Karen Hardee, principal of Hardee Associates Consulting. The Population Media Center creates and broadcasts radio and television dramas that promote family planning, environmental stewardship, and gender equality. Their many shows have reached tens of millions of people on 5 continents, and they include the Emmy-nominated East Los High, which ran for 4 seasons on Hulu. Karen Hardee provides expert consulting on issues related to sustainable development, reproductive health and planning, and women's rights. Dr. Hardee was a reviewer for the IPCC's 5th Assessment Report chapter on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and she recently contributed to the development of a national gender strategy for the Ministry of Public Health in Afghanistan. Bill and Karen, welcome to the Population Factor.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. So here we are, a world in ecological decline, with the global population increasing between 80 and 85 million people a year. What can be done about that? What are the solutions? Karen, what actions would you say you'd like to prioritize?
Thank you. I think, multi-sectoral solutions are what we need right now, and that is linking people's well-being with other sort of environmental, strengthening the environment. There's programming that has been undertaken for, 20, 30 years now called Population Health and Environment. And this is programming that it links, it goes to conservation areas like, the coastal areas of Madagascar or the mountainous areas of Tanzania, many other countries, and integrates health services into their conservation efforts and their efforts to strengthen their environment. And these have shown success. So that's just one type of programming.
But post-Cairo, post the 1994 Cairo Conference on Population and Development, one of the things we heard was don't link family planning with environmental outcomes. The kind of programs you're talking about sounds like they would seek to do that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Cairo, I think what Cairo brought us was to say, don't talk about population in the sense of population control, but really look at it in terms of people's well-being and women, particularly women's well-being and promoting women's reproductive rights. And that is so that is to say, don't look at the sort of big numbers and have targets for countries to reach with their sort of family planning goals in order to reduce population. But if you meet women's reproductive needs, it will have the effect of reducing population in the longer term, because there'll be many fewer unintended pregnancies, and
right.
And women will have the number of children that they want, and that number of children has tended to go down since Cairo. So there's been a lot of work since 1994, since ICPD, to really strengthen rights-based family planning programming rather than demographic, targeted programming. There's still those still crop up sometimes, but that's been really the general trend.
Bill, your thoughts on the solutions that we need?
Well, I think Karen's absolutely right. I was at the 1994 conference in Cairo and was involved in helping to organize the largest NGO forum at a UN conference in UN history at that event. And I also attended the 1974 conference, the first population conference the UN held. And there was a dramatic shift from the Bucharest conference in 74 to the Cairo conference in 94 in recognizing that coercion and policy attempts to regulate family size were a huge mistake. Certainly this happened with coercion in China and India.
Mm-hmm.
India and China both instituted coercive policies in the 1970s, and they really backfired and they were really unnecessary. And I think what has scared a lot of environmentalists away from addressing population is many environmentalists think along policy lines. And when it comes to population, they shudder at the idea of some policy. But in fact, totally human rights-based approaches to elevating the status of women and girls, including daughter education and stopping child marriage and stopping other forms of violence against women, as well as modeling small family norms through entertainment media, can be hugely influential in changing behavior without ever telling anybody what to do, just showing them different options and the consequences of those choices and allowing them to decide what's in their best interest. And when just one additional piece here, when one looks at the demographic and health survey data as to why people say they're not using contraception, the number one reason is wanting more children. But among the roughly 225 million women who don't want another pregnancy at the moment or in the next couple of years and are not using a contraceptive, the top reasons are male opposition, fear of health effects, religious opposition, basically fatalism, the belief that God determines how many children one's going to have and there's nothing they can do about it. And those are far more prominent in most countries than things like lack of access to services. So overcoming those cultural and informational barriers is key.
So this gets to a question that I had. If you think about population growth, as long as average fertility for women is over 2.1 or 2.2 children per woman, the population is going to continue to grow. So my question is just this: is the main driver of continued population growth unmet need, or is it the continued desire for large families? Bill, what's your take on that?
It varies by region of the world, but unmet need, just to give the definition, is not using a modern method of contraception and not wanting to be pregnant in the next 2 years. It's not unmet demand. So certainly close to half of those who are not using contraceptives are described as having an unmet need, but a slightly larger portion are people who are intentionally not using family planning methods in order to have more children. In many countries, let's take Africa, desired fertility and actual fertility are very close. That is, in East and most of Central Africa, desired fertility may be in the neighborhood of 4 or 5, and actual fertility may be 1/10 of a child higher than that. So people are coming close, but they're not perfect contraceptors. In West Africa, desired fertility is well above actual fertility. So in Africa's most populous country, Nigeria, fertility rate's about 5.7 children born to the average woman during her lifetime. And when women are asked how many children they think is ideal, they say 7 and men say 9. So this tradition of large families, and particularly in West Africa, is a major factor in growth in that region of the world. And addressing desired family size really includes changing norms with regard to what people think is normal. In Niger, fertility rate is 7.6. Women want 10 and men want 13. So they're not coming close to having as many children as they think is ideal because of poverty and poor health and other issues. But helping them achieve sustainability includes addressing desired family size.
Mm-hmm.
So, Karen, in 2017, you published a paper with John Bongartz titled "The Role of National Family Planning Programs in Meeting the Demand for Contraception in Sub-Saharan Africa." How important is it still then to increase access to contraception?
You know, family planning programs have been very important in as you say, expanding access to contraception and you know, getting contraception used. There's been a big debate in the literature. Oh, well, it's just development, just you know, just promote development, and population will take care of itself. And I think John Bongartz, particularly over the years, and it was really an honor to work with him, you know, has really shown that you need both. You absolutely need development, but you need family planning at the same time. You know, some people have said, well, and then so development, or just educate girls, and then, you know, fertility will take care of itself. And, you know, some of that is true, because if girls stay in school longer, then then they get married later, and then they tend to have fewer children. So, you know, that really is very important. But we've also shown, work that John and I did, that you need both. You need education and fertility. I've sat with heads of state, and I say to them, when they say, oh, we're just going to educate our girls and it's all going to be fine, I say, you know something? No matter how educated you are, if you don't want to get pregnant, you need a contraception, and that you get from a family planning program. And of course, they're taken aback, but it's true. You need both.
So we need, what I'm hearing then is rights and norms are both important here. Securing reproductive rights for women and couples, but also perhaps changing norms about family size. Bill mentioned reproductive fatalism. Both of you have talked many times. Changing norms about women's subservience is important. Empowering women to actually have a voice in how many children they have. So all of these things then are important. Karen, you brought up a view which is pushed, I think, primarily by Wolfgang Lutz and others in his demography group in Vienna. This view that educating girls is really the key to lowering fertility. And I think Lutz pushes it so far as to basically say, as long as we do that, everything else really will take care of itself. I just want to, since that view is so influential out there, I'd like to get clear on what your view is of that.
Well, it's interesting, because I also collaborated with a colleague, Dr. Leiwen Zhang, who worked with Wolfgang, so very familiar with Wolfgang's population pyramid, you know, population projections that include education. And we use data from India to show that, again, that, you know, fertility is lower if you do the projections based on, if you looked at it just with education or just with family planning and combining both. So again, I think we've even used Wolfgang's, you know, own methodology to show that both are really important.
Bill, your take on this, because your work with PMC is all about educating people. So you're bringing in the education component there. Your take on the argument that educating, keeping girls in school longer is all that's needed here.
I think Karen is right that it's a huge factor when you look at fertility rate by length of education, primary, secondary, or beyond. Fertility rate declines steadily the more years of schooling a woman has, but it's not sufficient. One needs access to modern methods of contraception. So both are required. And certainly creating demand for contraceptive services requires overcoming misinformation about safety and effectiveness, and overcoming various forms of opposition, male opposition, mother-in-law opposition, religious leader opposition, and personal opposition. People sometimes are opposed because of misinformation about their rights. So, and this is particularly true in places where girls are put into marriages at age 10, 11, 12, 13, and they're basically brought up by their husbands, and
Right.
they have no idea that they have rights of their own. And so helping people understand their rights is very important, along with education and helping them understand the safety and effectiveness of clinical methods of contraception.
So I had Florence Blondell on the show a week or two ago, and she's from Uganda. She was giving me some statistics on the percentage of girls who are married as child brides, let's just say 18 or younger. And there are very high percentages in many countries throughout Africa. So I think that is certainly a part of this that's hugely important, both in terms of a woman actually having agency to choose how many children she's going to have, and also simply in terms of the sooner in your life you start having children, the more children you are likely to have. Yes.
And you know, there are aspects of girls' education that many policymakers never think about. For example, Jane Goodall's Institute is working to protect chimpanzees in Uganda. And they realized so many girls, when they reach puberty and begin menstruating, they are missing a week of school every month. And after some period of time, they just drop out and get married and start having babies. And so what they did as a contribution to help slowing the population growth and improving girls' education is providing sanitary materials for these girls so they could stay in school when they were having their periods. And that type of adaptation that's needed for girls' education is something many people never think about, but it's critically important, along with modeling girls' education to their parents as an alternative, a much more positive alternative to selling the daughter into marriage. Many people think, well, the girl is a liability and I'll just pay off this huge expense by selling her into marriage at 12 or 13. And they don't think about what's that going to mean in terms of her welfare, let alone my grandchildren's welfare. So modeling, changing those norms is critically important. And then the cost of education, including school fees, uniforms, books, and other educational materials, is something that many people haven't given thought to. It's a huge barrier to go from being in favor of educating one's children to actually educating them. And that's something where governments need to do a much better job of putting funding in to make it to make education really accessible.
And there's been a lot of most of the focus on has been on primary education. So there's an additional need for attention to keeping girls in school even beyond primary school.
Right. So we're getting into the whole issue of a rights-based approach to these kind of questions, and especially the rights of girls and young women. Karen, do you want to sort of explain to viewers what's the basic idea behind rights-based family planning?
Sure. So this is not new. This goes back to 1968. There was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in 1968, there was a human rights conference in Tehran, in Iran, where the right of individuals and couples to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children. Actually, it was couples at that point, the right of couples. So this right has been enshrined in sort of global human rights, for over 50 years. And family planning programming, a lot of it has tried to be based on that. Although it's quite interesting, and maybe we'll pick up on this. The word responsibility is in that initial declaration, and that word has ended up being a bit problematic in the human rights in the Human Rights Committee or community, I should say. But what it says is that and so that declaration has then, that was in the 1974 bill. You mentioned Bucharest. It was in the 1974 Program of Action, 1984, 1994. So that basic human right of individuals and then couples to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children, with the information and services to do so, and without discrimination and with equality. So that's sort of the umbrella rights. But then there have been lots of conventions since then, including the right to the highest attainable standard of health, that then flows into the right for family planning and reproductive health information and services. So that's basically it. And I think, but there's the rights literacy is an issue right now. I mean, people sort of say, yes, everybody should have access to family planning services, but they don't quite understand what that means, and that it has legal and sort of global human rights teeth. That communities should be holding governments responsible for providing these types of services. So it's you have the right, but then how do you infuse programming with rights principles? So, for example, privacy and confidentiality is one of the human rights principles. How do we make sure that services are private, are confidential? How do we make sure that they're of high quality? How do we make sure that everybody has access? That in the words of the Sustainable Development Goals, that nobody is left behind. That there's full equity. So that's it, sort of in a nutshell what rights-based family planning is. It's not something different. It's not some like we throw away everything we've been doing and start all over again by any means. It's just making sure that you're using a rights lens as you implement programs.
And as you say, the way this has been discussed historically is in terms of the right of women and couples to freely and responsibly choose the size of their families. Mm-hmm. That language too, it was reiterated in Cairo in 1994. Mm-hmm. My sense is, as you hinted, the responsibility aspect of it, people have become less and less comfortable talking about that. And as an ethical philosopher, I see that as sort of a corollary of our inability in the modern West, and specifically in America, to talk about rights and responsibilities as sort of two sides of the same thing. We're comfortable talking about our rights and standing on our rights, demanding our rights for ourselves and others. We sometimes forget that if you don't have the flip side of that, acting responsibly, then that could undermine what we're trying to achieve here. Flourishing and good lives for everyone.
Can I just give an example of this? Because I've been watching, and Bill, I know you have also, and Phil, family planning in Rwanda. And of course, Rwanda went through just the horrific genocide. But President Paul Kagame, but even before that, before in the 80s and the 70s, that was one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. And President Paul Kagame said, we need to do something about this because, there are just a lot of people in Rwanda and it's so densely populated. So he very strongly supported family planning, both the right, but the responsibility. So he said, have children, have the number you want, but make sure you're able to support them. We're going to help. We want to be the Singapore of Africa. So it wasn't as though he said, you women of Rwanda, stop having so many children. This is bad. This is bad for the population. He said, we're all in this together. I'm going to implement policies that are good for the country, that family planning, at least. I know there's controversy about his rule, but family planning, but couples, you need to think about how many kids, you can support. So that's the one example that I've seen where a leader has really taken that rights and responsibilities aspect of it.
A need for responsibility and really educating people about responsible parenthood is illustrated by the U.S. foster care system, which we've become very familiar with. Our daughter joined our family at age 12. And the children who are in dangerous homes have often been born to parents who really should have been given good counseling to avoid parenthood given their circumstances. And they just fell into it and they weren't planning anything. And you see this in many countries around the world. Certainly, I know of many circumstances where men will have one girlfriend or spouse after another over a period of time, leaving children behind and not caring for any of them. Mm-hmm. And this issue is a very touchy issue, obviously, but clearly modeling responsible parenthood is important to avoid having children who are not being cared for and loved.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me talk about another kind of controversial and somewhat difficult issue. This is the whole question of governments setting targets for family planning programs. So post-Cairo, targets for family planning programs were singled out as a bad idea, as potentially leading to coercion. And so the consensus going forward seems to have been that that's a bad idea. So Karen, in one publication you helped to write, Right-Sized Family Planning, a Toolkit, there's this quote: "Rights-based family planning is driven by the needs and rights of people in the program that is meant to serve, rather than the program structure, system, staff, or numeric goals." Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of represents the general consensus. But are family planning targets really so bad in a world where the failure to end population growth could lead to disaster? What's your take on that?
I think it's, as Bill said earlier, that, China's program, India's program, Bangladesh, when they were, promoting vasectomies, they just backfire. They just are not a good idea. So targets are, they're a tough thing because, you need some numbers for planning purposes. You need to know how many contraceptives you need to order. You need to know, sort of basically how many health staff you need. So it seems that those kinds of sort of numbers for planning purposes have to be okay. But actually giving providers saying, you have to see this many women a month, you have to insert this many IUDs, those kinds of targets are a problem. And this, of course, came up with in 2012 when the world celebrated the London Summit on Family Planning, where world leaders got together with Melinda Gates and heads of state to sort of reinvigorate family planning. And they sort of announced a global goal of reaching 120 million additional users. And of course, people were, a lot of people, civil society, were up in arms saying, you're just reintroducing the targets, that we got rid of in Cairo. And what they said was, we want something ambitious. We want to be ambitious so that we have something to strive for. But that sort of pushback was actually really, really important and useful because it really made the partnership, which is now called FP 2020, it really made that partnership reinforce the rights, and that programming to achieve this goal absolutely has to be rights-based. It can't be just that those kind of targets for providers are simply not okay.
So let me push back on that a little bit. I mean, that seems to me like a reductio ad absurdum of pushing rights rather than responsibility. In other words, the Gates Foundation says we're going to give you tens of billions of dollars to try to meet half of the unmet need in family planning around the world, and people say no, that's a bad idea. When providing that contraception is in fact part of securing rights for people to do that. I mean, again, it's just an example, well, an example of failing to understand that with rights go responsibility, but maybe also an example of failing to understand that we don't have forever to deal with population issues.
You know, my take on this is if I'm a mid-level bureaucrat working for the government and I'm told that my evaluation and salary raise is dependent on how many women I sterilize, I'm much more likely to violate their right to make an informed decision than I am if that's not a factor in my evaluation. So I think, yes, at a global level, we need to set ambitious goals. And we certainly have a very serious crisis with regard to loss of biodiversity, which in the UN Environment Report, Program report that came out last year pointed to the fact that expanding human farming and expanding human habitation are the major causes of the loss of biodiversity that is now threatening the extinction of 1 million species. And it's this web of life that makes the planet habitable. So the stakes are high. But if we do this right in a rights-based approach, and we put our effort and money into such things as educating girls and elevating the status of women, along with reproductive health information and services, we can achieve the goal much more quickly and without backlash than we will if we have government officials telling people that they need to have a sterilization operation.
Okay, so we don't want mid-level government officials having quotas for how many sterilizations they have. Would it be fair to say we want them to have quotas for how many new people they sign up for contraception?
I think you have the same risk. Nobody wants to be lectured to and told what to do. They want to make these decisions themselves. And we believe, in our experience with using entertainment serialized dramas for modeling behavior, that in fact, modeling behavior by having stories about fictional characters who evolve through their own thinking and realize different consequences of their different behaviors is a far more effective and human rights-based approach to changing norms than having government officials saying you need to use a contraceptive or you need to do anything. That can backfire. And we saw this happen in India when Indira Gandhi instituted coercion with regard to sterilization, and she lost the next election, and rightly so. So it makes much more sense to use modeling and education, persuasive education perhaps, but not coercion in any form, including targets.
And I think the environmental community has sort of shied away from working on population issues because of such things as targets. But approaching the environmental community with no, this is rights-based. It's it's meeting people's needs. It's taking a client orientation rather than a program orientation. Makes people much more comfortable, and makes policymakers more comfortable with the discussion. And it gets away from this idea that somehow we're blaming African women for environmental degradation and climate change, which of course nobody is doing, but it sounds that way when you talk about, but we need to pressingly do something about population and meet targets and those kinds of things.
In fact, I've heard people say that we have coercion for stopping at red lights, and we have coercions for not committing murder. And we're now talking about the habitability of the planet. Why not use coercion? And the answer is, beyond the human rights violation, it doesn't work. Yeah. Most coercion, in fact, has been in the opposite direction, preventing people from planning their families by banning access to contraception or access to girls' education. And if you think about the community of governments of the world coming together to coerce people, the most likely outcome is they're going to coerce them in the wrong direction. I certainly, looking at the US government, would not want and not be comfortable with the US government deciding to coerce people to do anything related to reproduction, it would just backfire.
Sure.
But I think what's important to add there is, if you look at unintended pregnancy in the US, it's still almost half of pregnancies that are unintended. So Bill, I think it really reinforces what you're talking about, that it's lack of access to reproductive health services that's a much bigger problem than sort of coercion in the other direction.
So you are both making an excellent case for your arguments against coercion. And I don't really want to be in a position of arguing for coercion,
Yeah.
at least in the black and white way in which this is discussed. I don't want to start standing up for forced abortions or coerced sterilizations or anything like that. But we started with this issue of targets, and I am going to push back one more time on that. And I'll simply start by giving you some figures from the 2019 UN population projections. Democratic Republic of Congo, 2020 population 90 million. Projected 2100 population for the Congo. In the median variant, 362 million. That's over a 300% increase. Nigeria, 2020 population 206 million. Projected 2100 population 733 million. That's a greater than 250% increase. Now, not arguing about in favor of coercion, but I'm asking here, what really is the compassionate policy? Is it compassionate for governments not to set targets, for instance, for smaller family sizes, when Congo and Nigeria might not be able to feed people in the coming decades? Karen?
So no, that's a very good point. I think you talk about Nigeria, for example, and Nigeria is a huge country with, in southern Nigeria, the statistics, family size is much different than northern Nigeria. So I don't think that there are any blanket solutions like the government of Nigeria saying, okay, all of a sudden, people can only have 2 children. For one thing, and I lived in China, at the beginning of China's one-child policy. So I've sort of looked at that, what happened in that country over 30 years, and talk about a human rights violation, honestly. And they've so messed up their age structure now that they're going to be, facing the consequences of that disastrous policy for many decades. But China today could not enforce the one-child policy that it was able to do in 1979 and 1980. And so no country, there are some states in India that right now that are trying to legislate a 2-child policy, but I don't think there's any country in the world that could actually enforce one for one thing. But what it means is you need to look at the root causes. Why is it in northern Nigeria that family size desires are so much higher than in the South? Well, it's the different religions, different tribal groups. So you really need to I think what Bill's been saying, and I'm a big fan of the programming that that Bill does. I think it's really important. Look at social norms. How are we going to address social norms? How are we going to get to men? How are we going to get to the root causes of why there are differences in the desired family size? And I have to say, I also did some research in Ethiopia several years ago, where we asked about, this was looking at population and climate change, and we sort of asked the population questions at the end, because we wanted to get people's views on climate change first. And people said at that time, we would love to have more children. We love children. We would love to have 4 or 5 children, but we can't now. We know we can't now because we know that there's deforestation, there's environmental issues, and that a lot of that is caused because people need more room in the country. So I think that that's probably happening in West and Central Africa also, that yes, there's a high desired family size, but people are realizing, but we can't have that anymore. So I think that's a little bit where the sort of responsibility side is coming in.
Bill, with your demographic projections of those two countries, Congo and Nigeria, you reminded me of Lord Caradon's poem about demographers, which goes like this: "It is really no use in the end to be a demographer's friend, for she's given her heart to a graph and a chart, and at night she sleeps with a trend." And my reason for mentioning this is demographic projections are as good as the assumptions that are behind them. And certainly those projections are concerning, the median projections, not to mention the high projections. And I think it's perfectly okay to have a population policy at a country level to say we want to achieve the low projection. We want to ensure that we have as good a chance of achieving sustainability, including environmental sustainability, by doing everything we can in a rights-based context to help achieve that, including ensuring all girls are given primary and secondary education, including access to information, including sexuality education, along with modeling regarding health choices and consequences, plus access to contraceptive services and other reproductive health services. I've been to now 93 countries, and I've never been to a country where they're trying everything they can in a rights-based approach. And until we are doing what we can, we shouldn't even be thinking about using targets or coercion of any type, because those are most likely going to backfire. There is a whole lot more we could be doing. I'm very much aware that the work we're doing, and Karen, thank you for the compliment, is a drop in the bucket. When you're in a country like Nigeria and you're broadcasting in the Hausa-speaking North, you know, we did a show there that was 208 episodes long. It pulled in 71% of the population as weekly listeners to what was a twice-a-week broadcast. And we had characters modeling smaller family norms and stopping child marriage and use of family planning. And at 11 clinics that did questionnaires to new family planning adopters, 67% of them cited the program as the reason they had come. So, you know, it's possible through that kind of intervention to have a huge impact. And that was at a cost, counting the cost of all 208 episodes, including primetime air purchase across 4 states, of 30 cents per family planning adopter. So it was something that was simple and easy and in a rights-based context, and not nearly enough of that is going on. Until we're doing far more of that type of thing, we shouldn't be looking at measures that can backfire.
Well, I think we'll all agree that we want the kind of rights-based approach to family planning that you've both described. And I think we all agree that it's important to work to model small family norms. I want to shift a little in the time we have left and talk a little bit about the developed world. We've been talking primarily about trends and issues in the developing world. But of course, many of our populations in the developed world are still growing. Many developed nations probably have larger populations that they can sustainably support. Now, the good news in the developed world is that in most of the developed world, we have fertility rates substantially below replacement rate. And in some developed nations, we actually have declining populations. But there's been really a visceral reaction against declining populations in the developed world. As you know, it's almost always described as a problem instead of a success. So, Bill, should you be developing a telenovela for central bankers to get them to accept declining populations?
You are so seriously correct. You know, I spoke at the the World Economic Symposium in Germany, and I stood up in response to a panel discussion about climate change, which didn't mention population. And I pointed out the importance of population as a factor in climate change, which this panel had never mentioned. And then I said, you know, the government of Germany, this room was filled with economists, most of them German. I said, the government of Germany is paying parents $16,000 per German baby born. If we have a climate crisis, a water crisis, a food crisis, an energy crisis, and a population crisis, which this panel had just agreed to, yes, they should have mentioned it. Why are we doing that? Is it because we like German babies better than other babies? I have a whole group of writers in Nigeria doing a program there who would be happy to move to Germany if you need more people. But in fact, the issue here is economists are persuaded that the economy can expand forever, even though we're in a finite universe. And they think if it stops expanding, the economy will collapse. This is driven in part by people who are land speculators or in the housing market, and they measure the world by housing starts. But in fact, the economy can't grow forever. We need to achieve a sustainable economy, and we can't try to stimulate it by having more babies in countries where, in fact, the dependency of the elderly on the working population will be worsened by adding babies to the mix because they're also dependent. What we need to do is learn how to live sustainably in the declining population scenario. And a country that's a great example of that is Japan. Certainly it is possible and to be celebrated when countries go into declining population, because ultimately, if we are to be able to live on renewable resources alone, and by definition, non-renewables are being depleted as they're used up, we're going to have to achieve a much lower population ultimately in order for people to lead a decent quality of life. At 10 billion, it will be very difficult for most people to survive on renewable resources alone. So we need to work out an economic model that is not dependent on ever-growing population, because no matter what you may think, if you've never had a course in ecology, the fact is the population cannot grow forever.
So we've got just a few minutes left here. I'd like to ask both of you what you think about some other proposed solutions to population growth or overpopulation. And I'm just looking for a quick comment. So I'll start with you, Karen. Restrict child marriage, raise the legal marriage age to 18. For or against?
I think I'm for that. I'm for that, and a lot of countries are trying to do that. I think that is a good idea.
And that's
Bill.
something we could do in the United States as well. There's still many states where a 14-year-old girl can still be legally married.
Absolutely. Bill, disincentivize third and further children non-coercively by limiting government support to the first two children. For or against?
I am not in favor of that, but I think instead the way I would do it if I had the power to do this would be to take the government out of stimulating marriage and or childbearing at any level. In other words, I think the government should be neutral with regard to financial incentives, even for two children. So giving people a tax exemption for two children versus four children, I think the government should stay out of that. Giving people different income tax rates, whether they're single or married, I think the government has no business in doing that. So I think the best way is to remove the government from trying to incentivize that kind of behavior financially.
Karen, make sterilization free for both men and women.
You know what? Well, I am a huge proponent of male sterilization. I wish it were much more prevalent around the world. There's a problem with incentivizing one method over another, and that is that methods you have to have, as part of the human rights is full, free, and informed choice. And so so I would say make them, well, all contraceptives free would be fine, but not just one method. But increasing access to sterilization, not India needs to do the opposite, but many other countries need much more access to both female, but particularly male sterilization.
Bill, change the current foreign aid distribution, giving more support for health and education while cutting international military aid?
Yes, totally in favor of that, because military aid obviously is important in situations where there is terrorism or turbulence going on. But in fact, military aid is the last resort after all the efforts to help achieve a population that's educated and employed fail. So we need to put much more effort into the preventive measures before we do measures that are just picking up the pieces after the fact.
Karen, finally, connect family planning funding to international climate change funding.
Oh my goodness, absolutely, absolutely. That's so important to include family planning as one of the sort of adaptation measures and even mitigation also that is eligible for climate change funding. Absolutely.
And I just thought of one more potential idea here. Encourage nations to figure out what national populations are actually sustainable, and then put in place policies to decrease their populations until they reach that figure. Bill, what do you think?
I think this is a great idea. The Sustainable World Initiative, which existed a few years ago at the Population Institute, actually developed strategies for helping any country on the planet determine what their sustainable population was, given assumptions about quality of life. So you could look at the population of Nigeria and say, what is, at a Western European lifestyle, what is the sustainable population using only renewable resources? And when you know that figure, then you can make a decision as a government that's somewhat informed about how are we going to get there if that's what our goal is. Mm-hmm. And so doing that kind of analysis is a very good idea.
Well, obviously there's a lot more we could talk about, but I think this.
Can I give one shout out, Phil? And that is, I think that something that's been so destructive is the what we all call the global gag rule, and this ping-ponging of taking away funding for international organizations that do anything related to abortion. It is so disruptive. I think been talking about Nigeria. I think you could probably just look at U.S. assistance to Nigeria and see how disruptive, not being able to work with the International Planned Parenthood Federation, Marie Stopes, and even local groups within countries to provide family planning. And now under the Trump administration, it was HIV. So much disruption is really, really, really an issue. So looking forward to the next administration and that rule, that global gag rule being lifted.
It would be wonderful if we could get back to where we were in 1970 in this country, where it was much more of a bipartisan support for international family planning. Mm-hmm. At this stage, I don't know what we can do about that problem except vote for Democrats for president, because it's almost just a bone that Republican presidents are going to throw to their supporters, whatever their personal views about this. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're right. It's a huge issue, Karen. Well, again, wonderful discussion. I'd like to pat myself on the back for having not one, but two people on this show who obviously know so much more than I do about the ins and outs of these issues. I think it speaks very well to my own, self-assurance that I was willing to have you both on this show. But beyond that, I'd really like to thank you for being here. Karen, Bill, thanks so much for coming.
Phil, thank you so much. It was a very enjoyable discussion.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you so much, Phil.
Can we have you on the show again?
Delighted.
Absolutely.